Sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that ever will. When grief teaches you that life can change in a heartbeat, you learn to treasure the quiet moments that follow. Elise Morrison has spent 10 years in her mountain cabin, finding peace in solitude after losing her husband. Her days are simple now, writing, reading, watching snow fall through tall windows. But one winter evening, a bleeding stranger knocks on her door during a blizzard. She doesn't know that Mark is a crime boss, running from his own people. She only knows he needs help. What starts as one night of shelter becomes something neither expected. Can two people who've lost everything find hope in each other? What happens when his dangerous past catches up to their newfound peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the frost-etched windows of Elise Morrison's cabin, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors that David had laid with his own hands 15 years ago. She stood at the kitchen counter, grinding coffee beans in the manual grinder he'd bought her for their 10th anniversary. The familiar rhythm as comforting as a prayer. The aroma filled the small space, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace that had burned low through the night. At 53, Elise had learned to find contentment in these small rituals. The coffee grinding, the careful measurement of water, the precise timing that produced the perfect cup. It was a far cry from the chaos of her former life in Denver, where mornings had been a blur of rushing children to school, grabbing travel mugs, and racing through traffic to reach the newspaper office where she'd worked as a features editor. That life felt like someone else's story now. She carried her steaming mug to the picture window that overlooked the valley below. Snow had fallen again during the night, adding another layer to the pristine blanket that covered the pine trees, stretching toward the distant peaks. The silence was profound here, broken only by the occasional call of a hawk or the whisper of wind through the branches. It was the kind of silence that had frightened her at first, when she'd fled here in the raw aftermath of David's accident. Now, it felt like a protective embrace. The cabin itself was modest, but perfectly suited to her solitary life. David had inherited it from his grandfather, and they'd spent weekends here during their marriage, talking about retirement plans and dreams of writing the novel that lived somewhere in the back of her mind. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and living areas, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 bedrooms flanked a small bathroom, and a loft above served as her writing space. Every surface bore traces of David's craftsmanship: the built-in bookshelves, the window seat with hidden storage, the dining table he'd made from a single piece of pine. Elise settled into her favorite armchair, the one positioned to catch both the morning light and the view of the mountains. Her laptop sat on the side table, displaying the manuscript she'd been working on for the past 3 years. The cursor blinked at her accusingly from the middle of chapter 12, where it had remained frozen for the past 6 months. The story was about a woman who'd lost her way and was trying to find it again, not exactly groundbreaking territory, but it was honest work, and honesty had become important to her in ways she'd never understood before David's death. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled despite herself. Sarah, her younger sister, called every Tuesday morning like clockwork, part of what Elise had come to think of as the Elise Watch. The careful monitoring her family, performed to ensure she hadn't completely disappeared into hermit mode. "Good morning, sunshine." Sarah's voice carried the forced cheerfulness that meant she was about to launch into another campaign to draw Elise back into the world of the living. "Good morning. How are the kids?" "Growing too fast, as usual." Emma got accepted to Colorado State, and Jake made varsity basketball. Sarah paused, and Elise could almost hear her gathering courage for the real purpose of the call. "Listen, I was thinking, why don't you come down for Emma's graduation party next month? Nothing fancy, just family and a few friends. You could stay with us, or if you prefer, there's that nice bed and breakfast downtown, Sarah." Elise's voice was gentle but firm. "We've talked about this. I know, but Elise, it's been 10 years. I'm not saying you need to move back to the city or start dating again or anything dramatic like that. I'm just saying maybe it's time to let people back in, just a little." Elise stared out at the snow-covered landscape, thinking about the woman she'd been before David's accident. That Elise had been social, confident, always ready with a laugh or a story. She'd hosted dinner parties, organized office celebrations, never met a stranger she couldn't charm into conversation. That woman felt as distant as the mountains beyond her window. "I'm fine here, Sarah. Really. I have everything I need. Everything except people. Elise, I love you, but you're wasting away up there. You're 53, not 93. You have so much life left to live." The familiar weight of guilt settled in Elise's chest. She knew her family worried, knew they saw her retreat to the mountains as an unhealthy escape. But they hadn't been there in the emergency room when the doctors came out wearing those careful, professional expressions that telegraphed devastating news before they spoke a word. They hadn't sat through the long nights afterward, when the silence in their Denver home had felt like a living thing, pressing against her until she could barely breathe. "I'm working on my book," Elise said finally. "That's not wasting away. That's, how many pages have you written this month?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elise looked at her laptop screen, at the cursor that hadn't moved in weeks. "Writing isn't just about pages, Sarah. It's about thinking, processing. It's about living, Elise. You can't write about life if you're not living it." After they hung up, Elise sat quietly for a long time, watching the play of light and shadow across the snow. Sarah wasn't wrong. Exactly. The book had stalled because the protagonist's journey toward renewal felt false when Elise couldn't imagine that kind of renewal for herself. How could she write about someone finding their way back to life when she'd chosen to step away from it so completely? She'd moved to the cabin 3 months after David's funeral, when the well-meaning casseroles had stopped coming and the sympathy cards had been filed away. But the silence in their Denver house had become unbearable. Their friends had tried to include her, but every gathering felt like attending her own wake. She was the tragic widow, the one who reminded everyone how quickly happiness could be snatched away. She'd started declining invitations, then stopped answering the phone, until finally the invitations stopped coming altogether. The cabin had offered something Denver couldn't, the permission to grieve without audience. Here, she could cry when the sunset reminded her of the evening walks she and David used to take, could rage at the unfairness of losing him just as they'd begun planning their golden years, could sit in silence for hours without anyone suggesting she get back out there. The mountains didn't judge her for wearing his old flannel shirts or for keeping his coffee mug in the cabinet, even though she never used it. Her daily routine had evolved slowly, settling into patterns that brought comfort through repetition. She woke at dawn, made coffee, and read for an hour by the window. Then she'd work on her writing until lunch, taking breaks to tend the small vegetable garden David had started behind the cabin. Afternoons were for correspondence. She'd maintained a few friendships through letters and emails and household tasks. Evenings were for reading, often accompanied by a glass of the wine David had loved, but she'd never developed a taste for until after he was gone. The closest town, Pine Ridge, was 20 minutes down the mountain road. She drove there once a week for groceries and supplies, exchanging pleasantries with the handful of locals who'd come to know her as the writer who lives in the old Henderson cabin. There was Martha at the grocery store, who always asked about her book and shared updates about her grandchildren. Tom at the hardware store, who'd helped her learn to maintain the cabin's quirky plumbing and temperamental generator. Dr. Richards, who'd become something like a friend over the years, checking on her when she came to town and occasionally stopping by the cabin when his rounds brought him up the mountain. These brief interactions sustained her need for human connection without demanding more than she felt capable of giving. They were relationships with boundaries, comfortable in their limitations, free from the emotional complexity that had once defined her social life. The afternoons stretched ahead of her, predictable and peaceful. She would work on chapter 12 for a while, though she suspected the cursor would remain stubbornly stationary. Then she'd prepare dinner, probably the chicken soup she'd been working through for 3 days, and settle in with the mystery novel she'd started last week. The weather forecast promised more snow tonight, which meant tomorrow would bring the particular silence that only heavy snowfall could create. As if the world had been wrapped in cotton and tucked away from itself. It was a good life, she told herself. A quiet life, but a good one. She had books and music, her writing and her garden, the ever-changing drama of weather and seasons played out against the backdrop of the mountains. She had memories of 22 years with a man who'd loved her completely, and the hard-won peace that came from learning to live with loss instead of fighting it. But as evening approached and she found herself standing at the kitchen window again, watching shadows lengthen across the snow, Elise wondered if peace and contentment were the same thing. If the life she'd built here was truly fulfilling, or if it was simply the absence of pain. The question felt dangerous, like poking at a barely healed wound, so she pushed it aside and turned to prepare her solitary dinner. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling around the cabin. The weather service had mentioned a storm system moving in from the west, but mountain weather was unpredictable. It might blow over by morning, or it might settle in for days. Either way, she was prepared. The pantry was well stocked, the generator was fueled and ready, and she had enough firewood to last through the worst of it. As she stirred her soup and listened to the wind beginning to howl around the eaves, Elise Morrison had no way of knowing that this storm would bring more than snow to her door. She had no way of knowing that by tomorrow, her carefully constructed world of solitude would be irrevocably changed by the arrival of a stranger who carried secrets as heavy as the grief she'd been harboring for 10 long years. The storm arrived with the fury of something personal. By 8 o'clock, the wind was howling like a living thing around the cabin, driving snow horizontally across the windows in sheets so thick that the familiar outline of the pine trees disappeared completely. Elise had seen mountain storms before, but this felt different, angrier, more insistent, as if nature had a score to settle. She checked the weather radio again, though she already knew what it would tell her. The storm had intensified beyond all predictions, dumping snow at a rate of 3 inches per hour, with winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. The mountain roads would be impassable until morning at the earliest, possibly longer if the storm continued through the night as forecasted. The power had flickered twice already, each time sending her to double-check her emergency supplies. Flashlights with fresh batteries lined the kitchen counter. Candles stood ready in holders throughout the main room. The generator waited in the shed, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. The fireplace could heat the main living area adequately, and she had enough split wood stacked on the covered porch to last a week. As she moved through her storm preparations, Elise found herself thinking about David and how he'd always made her feel safe during weather like this. He'd had a calm competence about practical matters that she'd come to rely on more than she'd realized at the time. Now, 10 years later, she'd learned to be her own source of security, but nights like this still carried echoes of vulnerability. She was adding another log to the fire when the knocking began. At first, she thought it was just the wind, a loose shutter or a branch beating against the siding. But then it came again, deliberate and rhythmic. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more. Someone was at her door. Elise froze, poker still in her hand. In 10 years of living here, no one had ever come to the cabin unannounced, let alone during a blizzard. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain, and anyone with sense would have taken shelter hours ago. Her mind raced through possibilities. Someone stranded on the mountain road, a hiker caught in the storm, an emergency that had brought one of the locals up the treacherous path to her door. The knocking came again, weaker this time, almost desperate. She approached the door cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the small window beside the entrance, she could see nothing but swirling snow illuminated by the porch light. The knocker was standing to the side, out of view. "Who's there?" she called through the heavy wooden door. "Please." The voice was male, barely audible over the wind. "I need help." Elise hesitated, her hand on the deadbolt. Every instinct screamed caution. She was alone, isolated, with no way to call for help if her phone lines went down. But the voice carried a note of genuine desperation that tugged at something deeper than fear. "Are you hurt?" she called back. "Yes. My car went off the road. Please, I'm bleeding." The words galvanized her. She slid back the deadbolt and opened the door, immediately gasping as the wind drove snow into her face with stinging force. A man stood on her porch, swaying slightly, one hand pressed against his side. Even in the dim light, she could see dark stains on his jacket. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with dark hair now white with snow. His clothes were expensive, a wool coat that had probably cost more than she spent on groceries in a month, leather shoes that were completely inappropriate for mountain weather. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark, intelligent, and holding a pain that went deeper than physical injury. "Thank God," he breathed, and then he was falling forward. Elise caught him instinctively, staggering under his weight as they stumbled through the doorway. She managed to get the door closed and locked before helping him to the couch. In the firelight, she could see the extent of his condition. His face was pale with cold and blood loss, his breathing shallow. The dark stain on his jacket was spreading. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Where are you hurt?" "Side," he managed. "Cut myself on the car door when it rolled." She helped him out of his jacket, revealing a white dress shirt soaked with blood. The cut was on his left side, just below his ribs, deep enough to require stitches, but not immediately life-threatening if she could stop the bleeding. "I need to see how bad this is," she said. "Can you lift your shirt?" He nodded, wincing as he raised the fabric. The wound was about 4 inches long, still bleeding steadily but not arterial. She'd seen worse during her brief stint as a volunteer EMT years ago, back when she and David had been young and idealistic about helping their community. "I'm going to get some supplies," she told him. "Don't move." In the bathroom, she gathered everything she could find: clean towels, antiseptic bandages, even the sewing kit David had kept for emergency repairs. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed, but she forced herself to focus. This man, this stranger, needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. When she returned, he was watching her with those dark eyes, alert despite his obvious pain. "I'm Mark," he said. "Mark," he hesitated for just a moment. "Mark Stevens, Elise Morrison. This is going to hurt, but I need to clean the wound." He nodded, gripping the arm of the couch as she worked. The antiseptic made him hiss through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. As she cleaned the blood, she could see that the cut was clean but deep. It would need stitches, but her small emergency kit would have to suffice. "You're very calm," he observed as she worked. "Medical training?" "A little. My husband and I took EMT classes years ago." She threaded a needle with steady hands. "This is going to hurt more than the cleaning. I can handle it." And he could, she realized. Most people would have been crying or at least cursing by now, but Mark endured the stitching with only the occasional sharp intake of breath. There was something about his stillness, his control, that spoke of someone accustomed to pain and discomfort. "There," she said finally, securing the last stitch. "That should hold until you can get to a real doctor." "Thank you." He leaned back against the couch cushions, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Don't think about it." She was wrapping gauze around his torso now, trying not to notice how the firelight played across the muscles of his chest and shoulders. He was in good shape for a man his age, better than good. "What were you doing on the mountain road in this weather?" Again, that slight hesitation. "Business meeting in Aspen. Thought I could beat the storm. He gestured toward the window, where snow continued to pound against the glass. Obviously miscalculated. The roads won't be passable until tomorrow at the earliest. You'll have to stay here tonight. Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. You're injured and stranded. Besides, she added with a small smile, I haven't had house guests in about 10 years. It might be good for me. As she helped him into one of David's old sweaters, the sleeves were too short, but it was warm and dry. Elise wondered what she was doing. 48 hours ago, she'd been content in her solitude, protective of her carefully ordered world. Now she was tending to a stranger's wounds and offering him shelter, and the strangest part was how natural it felt. Can I use your phone? Mark asked. I should let people know I'm safe. Of course. It's in the kitchen. She watched from the corner of her eye as he made his call, speaking in low tones she couldn't quite catch. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself even while injured, that suggested he was accustomed to command. When he hung up, she noticed him glance at her bookshelf, his eyes scanning the titles with genuine interest. You're a reader, he observed, and a writer, or trying to be. What do you write? It was such a simple question, but it had been months since anyone had asked. Fiction, stories about people finding their way through difficult times. He nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like something the world needs more of. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, by the warmth of the fire, Elise Morrison found herself talking to a stranger about books and stories and the small acts of courage that defined ordinary lives. She had no way of knowing that the man calling himself Mark Stevens carried business cards in his jacket pocket that bore the name Marco Castellano, or that his business meeting had been an attempt to prevent a war between crime families. She knew only that for the first time in years, the silence in her cabin didn't feel like protection. It felt like possibility. Morning arrived with the peculiar silence that only follows heavy snowfall. Elise woke in her own bed, momentarily disoriented by the memory of the previous evening. Had she really spent hours talking with a stranger by her fireplace? Had she really stitched up a wounded man and offered him shelter without knowing anything about him beyond his name? The smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen confirmed that it hadn't been a dream. She found Mark, she still couldn't think of him as anything but Mark, standing at her stove, carefully tending a pan of scrambled eggs. He'd managed to find ingredients she'd forgotten she had. Real bacon from the freezer, fresh herbs from the small pots on her windowsill, even the good cheese she saved for special occasions. You should be resting, she said, though she couldn't help admiring how competent he looked in her kitchen. David's sweater fit him better this morning, or maybe he just wore it with more confidence. I heal better when I'm moving. He glanced at her over his prize shoulder, and she noticed his color was much improved. Besides, it's the least I can do. You saved my life last night. I think you're being a bit dramatic. Am I? His expression grew serious. Hypothermia sets in fast in weather like that. If you hadn't opened your door, but I did. She moved to the coffee pot, needing something to do with her hands. How are you feeling? Any fever? Dizziness? Some soreness? But that's expected. You did good work. He plated the eggs and set them on her small dining table, which he'd already set for two. I found your chess set. Beautiful craftsmanship. Elise's breath caught. The chess set sat on the table beside their plates, the hand-carved pieces arranged in starting position. David had made it during the winter before he died, working on it in the evenings while she graded papers or worked on articles. Each piece was unique, carved with intricate details that had taken him months to complete. My husband made that, she said quietly. He was an artist. He was a high school shop teacher, but yes, I suppose he was an artist too. She sat across from Mark, studying the familiar pieces. He was going to teach me to play properly once he finished it. We never got the chance. Mark's hand stilled on his coffee cup. I'm sorry. It was 10 years ago. car accident on an icy road. She was surprised how easily the words came. Usually, she deflected questions about David's death, changed the subject before anyone could offer sympathy she didn't want. But something about the quiet morning and Mark's presence made honesty feel natural. 10 years alone up here. Alone by choice. She took a bite of the eggs, which were perfectly seasoned with herbs she'd grown herself. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My wife." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, and Elise saw pain flicker across his features. She believed food was love made tangible. Said you could tell everything about a person by how they treated a meal. What would she think of this one? Mark considered the questions seriously. She'd say, "I was trying to impress someone important." The admission hung between them, neither awkward nor presumptuous, just honest. Elise found herself studying his face, really looking at him for the first time. He was handsome in a weathered way, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure. His hands, wrapped around the coffee mug, were strong but gentle, and she noticed he wore no wedding ring. "How long?" she asked. 8 years. Cancer." "I'm sorry." She fought hard, longer than the doctors expected. He met her eyes across the table. "But some fights you can't win, no matter how much you want to." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the chess set between them like a bridge across their shared understanding of loss. Outside, the world remained white and still, the storm having blown itself out during the night. "Would you like me to teach you?" Mark asked finally, nodding toward the chessboard. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You're not imposing. I'm the one who showed up bleeding on your doorstep, remember?" His smile was gentle, transforming his entire face. "Besides, it would be an honor to help you finish something your husband started." And so Elise found herself learning chess from a stranger who spoke about the game with the patience of someone who understood that some lessons were about more than the subject being taught. Mark's hands were steady as he demonstrated how each piece moved, his voice calm as he explained strategy and positioning. "Chess is about seeing possibilities," he said, moving his knight in an L-shaped pattern. "Every move opens some paths and closes others. The art is in understanding which possibilities matter most." "It seems overwhelming," Elise admitted, studying the board. "So many options. Start small. Don't try to see the whole game at once. Focus on the next move, then the one after that." He reset the pieces to starting position. Chess teaches patience. Sometimes the best thing you can do is wait for your opponent to make a mistake. They played 3 games, Mark patiently correcting her moves and explaining why certain strategies worked better than others. Elise found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The concentration required pushed other thoughts from her mind, the unfinished manuscript, Sarah's worried phone calls, the careful loneliness she'd cultivated like a garden. "You're a natural," Mark said after she managed to capture his bishop in their 3rd game. "You think several moves ahead. I used to be good at seeing patterns. Comes from editing, I suppose. You learn to spot what doesn't belong." "What doesn't belong in your life up here?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "You seem—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Content isn't the right word. Settled. Maybe. But there's something restless in your eyes, like you're waiting for something to change." No one had seen that in her for years. She'd become so good at projecting serene acceptance that even she sometimes believed it. But Mark's observation felt uncomfortably accurate. "Maybe I've been settled too long," she admitted. "Settlement can be a form of hiding. Speaking from experience. More than I'd like to admit." They were interrupted by the buzz of Mark's phone, which he'd placed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at it, and something in his expression shifted, became more guarded, more alert. "Excuse me," he said, rising from the table. "I should take this." He stepped onto the covered porch to make his call, speaking in low tones she couldn't hear through the glass door. Elise found herself watching him, noting how his posture changed during the conversation, straighter, more commanding. When he returned, The easy warmth had been replaced by something more complex. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Work complications. It might take longer than expected to get my car situation sorted out." He hesitated. "I hate to ask, but would it be possible to stay another night? I can pay for the inconvenience." "Don't be ridiculous. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Relief flickered across his features. "Thank you. I promise I'm not usually this much trouble." But as Mark helped her clear the breakfast dishes, Elise found herself wondering what kind of work required such secretive phone calls, and why a simple car accident was taking so long to resolve. She pushed the questions aside, telling herself it was none of her business. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mark Stevens than he was letting on. The second day fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. After another breakfast cooked by Mark, this time French toast, that rivaled anything she'd ever had in a restaurant, Elise found herself doing something she hadn't done in months, talking about her writing. They sat in the living room, Mark stretched out on the couch with his injury properly elevated, while Elise curled in her chair with her laptop balanced on her knees. She'd meant to work quietly while he rested, but somehow the conversation had turned to her stalled novel. "Read me something," Mark said, his voice carrying genuine interest. "Oh, I couldn't. It's not very good." "I doubt that. You have the kind of careful way with words that suggests you think about them before you speak them. That's rare." Elise found herself scrolling to a passage she'd written early in the process, when the words had flowed more easily. It's about a woman named Claire who lost her husband and moved to a small coastal town to start over. "Sounds familiar," Mark said with a gentle smile. "All fiction is autobiography in disguise." She cleared her throat and began to read. Claire had become an expert at measuring time in coffee cups and tide cycles, in the predictable rhythms that asked nothing of her but observation. The cottage by the sea offered the gift of insignificance. She could sit on her porch and watch ships pass on the horizon, secure in the knowledge that her own small drama was invisible against such vastness. But some mornings, when the light hit the water just right, she found herself wondering if safety and healing were the same thing, or if she'd simply become very good at not wanting what she couldn't have. The silence that followed felt loaded with understanding. "That's beautiful," Mark said finally. "And honest. What happens to her?" "I don't know. That's where I got stuck." Elise closed the laptop. "I can write about her isolation, her grief, the careful way she's rebuilt her life. But when it comes to writing her way back into the world," she shrugged, "I apparently don't know how that story goes. Maybe you're not supposed to know yet. Maybe Claire is waiting for something to happen that changes the rules of her world. Such as a stranger showing up who makes her remember what she used to want." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. Elise felt her cheeks warm and looked away, suddenly aware of how intimate this moment was, the two of them alone in her sanctuary, talking about desire and possibility, while snow continued to fall beyond the windows. "You make it sound simple," she said. "Not simple. Necessary." Mark shifted on the couch, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Can I tell you something? Yesterday, when I was standing on your porch, I wasn't just looking for shelter from the storm, I was looking for shelter from my life. And you gave me that, no questions asked. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped. That's not the action of someone who's forgotten how to live. That's the action of someone who's been living very carefully, waiting for the right moment to step back out into the light." Elise studied his face, trying to read the emotions there. "You don't know anything about me. I know you make your own coffee from beans. You grind by hand because it gives you a sense of control over at least one thing each day. I know you keep your husband's tools organized in the shed, even though you probably don't use most of them, because maintaining them feels like maintaining a connection. I know you've been alone for 10 years, but you still set the table for 2 when you have a guest. Because hospitality is so deeply ingrained in you that it survived even isolation." The accuracy of his observations was unsettling. "You're very observant. Occupational hazard. Something flickered across his expression, regret, maybe, or caution. I've learned to read people quickly. It served me well in business. What kind of business exactly? Again, that slight hesitation she was beginning to recognize. Consulting, conflict resolution, mainly. I help people find solutions when they've painted themselves into corners. It was a vague answer that felt like another deflection, but before Elise could pursue it, Mark was changing the subject. Would you show me around? I'd like to see more of what your husband built here. And so, she found herself giving him a tour of the cabin, pointing out David's handiwork with a pride that surprised her. She showed him the built-in bookshelves with their hidden storage compartments, the ingenious fold-down desk in the loft where she did her writing, the way David had positioned windows to capture both morning light and mountain views. In the bedroom, Mark paused at the photograph on her nightstand, her wedding picture, taken 23 years ago on a beach in California. She and David were laughing at something outside the frame, his arm around her waist, her dress blowing in the ocean breeze. "You were beautiful," Mark said. "You still are." The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I was young. Beauty isn't about age. It's about the light behind someone's eyes." He turned to face her fully. "Yours went out for a while, didn't it? But it's coming back." They were standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that belonged to a different world than her mountain sanctuary. Close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the small scar along his jawline that spoke of some old injury. "Mark," she began, though she wasn't sure what she wanted to say. "I know this is complicated," he said softly. "I know I'm a stranger who showed up at your door with more problems than I've told you about. But yesterday, when you opened that door, it felt like coming back to life." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed again. The sound broke the spell between them, and Mark stepped back with obvious reluctance. "I'm sorry. I have to. Of course." This time he took the call in the kitchen, but even from the bedroom, Elise could hear the tension in his voice. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Just work. Some situations require more delicate handling than others." He managed to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for the tour. Your husband was a craftsman." That evening, they prepared dinner together, a simple pasta dish that turned into something special through their collaboration. Mark proved to be as competent with kitchen tasks as he was with everything else, moving around her small space with an economy of motion that suggested he was comfortable taking charge when needed. "You're a man of many talents," Elise observed as he expertly filleted the trout she'd had in her freezer. "You learn to adapt when you travel as much as I do." "Do you enjoy it?" "The traveling?" "I used to. Lately, it feels more like running." "From what?" Mark's hands stilled on the knife. "Mistakes, expectations, the weight of choices I made when I was younger and thought I understood how the world worked." It was the most honest thing he'd said about himself, and Elise felt something shift between them, a deepening of trust that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Later, as they sat by the fire playing another game of chess, she found herself studying his hands as he moved the pieces. Strong hands, she noticed, with small scars that suggested a life more complicated than business consulting. But when he looked up and caught her watching, his smile was so genuine, so warm, that her doubts faded into the background. By the third day, Mark's presence had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like a revelation of how empty her life had become. The cabin, which had felt perfectly sized for one person, now seemed to expand around their shared occupancy. Conversations flowed over coffee that lasted until lunch, comfortable silences punctuated by observations about the weather or the books she kept returning to. "Your car," Elise said over breakfast, cutting into the pancakes Mark had somehow produced from her meager supplies. "Shouldn't we call someone about getting it towed?" Mark's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Already handled. My insurance company is taking care of everything." That was fast. "I have good coverage." He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. The adjuster said it might take a few days to arrange transport on these mountain roads, if that's still okay with you. It was more than okay, and that realization troubled her. When had she become so attached to this stranger's company? When had his departure shifted from an anticipated return to normalcy to something she dreaded? "Of course," she said. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much for entertainment. My idea of excitement is finishing a crossword puzzle. I noticed you keep them by your chair. The Sunday Times puzzle from 3 weeks ago is still sitting there. Half finished." She flushed. "I got stuck on 14 across. 7-letter word for a new beginning. I saw you working on it yesterday. Do you know the answer? Rebirth. But I think you already knew that." The word hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them acknowledged directly. Elise found herself looking away, suddenly conscious of how this man saw through her carefully constructed defenses. After breakfast, Mark insisted on helping with the dishes, and they fell into an easy rhythm at the small sink. His sleeve rolled up as he washed, revealing an expensive watch that seemed incongruous with his story of being a traveling consultant. The watch face caught the light, and Elise noticed it was a Rolex, not the kind of timepiece someone wore unless they had serious money. "That's a beautiful watch," she commented. Mark glanced down at his wrist, and something flickered across his expression. "A gift. From my business partners when we closed a big deal. Must have been quite a deal." It was. He handed her a plate to dry, their fingers brushing in the transfer. Sometimes success comes with complications you don't anticipate. Before she could ask what he meant, his phone began buzzing on the counter. This time, instead of his usual apologetic excuse, Mark simply declined the call. "You don't have to ignore your work for me," Elise said. "My work can wait." He gestured between them, around the warm kitchen, toward the snow-covered world beyond the windows. "This is the first time in years I've felt like I could breathe." The admission was so raw, so unexpected, that Elise set down the dish towel and really looked at him. Beneath his calm exterior, she could see traces of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights, a tension in his shoulders that suggested he carried burdens he couldn't share. "What kind of complications?" she asked gently. Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the pristine snow. "Have you ever made choices that seemed right at the time, but as the years passed, you realized you'd lost yourself somewhere in the consequences?" "Every day for the past 10 years. He turned to face her fully. "I built a life that looked successful from the outside. Money, respect, influence. But somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was underneath all of that. I became what people needed me to be instead of who I wanted to be. It's not too late to change that, isn't it? Some choices bind you to a path. You can't just walk away when you realize you're in the wrong life." There was something desperate in his voice that made Elise want to reach for him, to offer the kind of comfort she hadn't given anyone in years. Instead, she dried her hands slowly, choosing her words carefully. "My therapist used to say that we tell ourselves we're trapped because leaving feels more dangerous than staying. But most of the time, the only thing keeping us prisoner is our own fear of what comes next." "You had a therapist?" "For about 6 months after David died. I couldn't understand why everyone expected me to move on when moving felt like betrayal." She folded the dish towel with precise movements. "She helped me realize that honoring the past and embracing the future aren't mutually exclusive." "Did you believe her?" "Eventually, though it took me a lot longer to put it into practice." Mark's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression darkened. "I need to step outside for a minute," he said, his tone shifting to something more formal, more guarded. Elise watched through the kitchen window as he paced the covered porch, speaking in low, urgent tones. Even from inside, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't going well. When he returned, 20 minutes later, his face was carefully neutral, but she could see the storm beneath the calm. "Everything all right?" she asked, though it clearly wasn't. "Fine, just business complications that need attention." He managed a smile that didn't convince either of them. "I might need to make a few more calls today. I hope that's not a problem." "Of course not, but Mark, if you're in some kind of trouble—" "I'm not in trouble," he said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. "Nothing I can't handle anyway." But as the afternoon wore on, his phone continued to ring with increasing frequency. Each call seemed to wind him tighter, until the easy companionship of the morning felt like something from another lifetime. By evening, Mark was pacing the cabin like a caged animal, his attention split between their conversation and whatever crisis was unfolding in his other life. "You don't have to stay on my account," Elise said finally, unable to watch his agitation any longer. "If you need to go, I don't want to go." The words came out fierce, almost angry. "That's the problem. For the first time in years, I don't want to be anywhere but exactly where I am." "Then stay. It's not that simple." "It could be." Mark stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that broke, her heart, hope and longing warring with resignation. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then help me understand." For a moment, she thought he might tell her everything. She could see him weighing possibilities, calculating risks, wrestling with a decision that clearly went far beyond their conversation. But then his phone rang again, and the moment shattered. This time, when he answered, Elise heard a name that chilled her: Castellano. Mark's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw the exact moment he realized what he'd revealed. Fear flickered across his features, not fear for himself, but fear for her, for what his presence might have brought to her quiet sanctuary. "Elise," he said after, ending the call, his voice heavy with something that sounded like goodbye. "We need to talk." Mark's hands were shaking as he set the phone down on the coffee table. In the firelight, his face looked haggard, older than his years, carrying the weight of secrets that had grown too heavy to bear alone. "There's something I need to show you," he said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. Elise watched as he pulled out his wallet, his movements deliberate and careful, like a man preparing to disarm a bomb. From behind his driver's license, he extracted a small photograph, its edges worn from handling. He held it for a moment, staring down at it with an expression of such profound loss that Elise felt her heart clench. "This is my family," he said, extending the photo toward her. "My wife, Maria, and our daughter, Sophia." The photograph showed a younger Mark with his arms around a beautiful dark-haired woman and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6. They were laughing at something outside the frame, their joy so radiant it seemed to glow from the faded paper. Maria's hand rested on Mark's chest, and Sophia was reaching up to touch his face with the casual affection of a child who had never known anything but love. "They're beautiful," Elise whispered, though she could see in his eyes that the past tense was necessary. Sophia was 7 when the cancer took Maria. Old enough to understand that Mommy was sick, not old enough to understand why Daddy couldn't fix it. Mark's voice grew rough. "I promised Maria I'd protect our daughter, give her a normal life. Instead, He stopped, running his hands through his hair, and Elise could see him wrestling with how much truth to reveal. "What happened to Sophia?" she asked gently. "Car accident. 3 years after Maria died. I was at work, always at work." The words came out broken, each one costing him. The nanny was driving her to piano lessons. A drunk driver ran a red light. Elise's breath caught. "Oh, Mark, I lost them both. My whole world gone, and the worst part is I wasn't even there. I was in a meeting, making money, building an empire that meant nothing without them to share it with." The pain in his voice was so raw that Elise found herself moving to the couch, sitting beside him without conscious thought. She didn't touch him, not yet, but her presence seemed to anchor him. "After Sophia died, I changed, became someone I didn't recognize, harder, more ruthless. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. He looked at the photograph again. Maria used to say, I had a good heart. I'm not sure she'd recognize the man I became. Grief changes us, Elise said softly. Sometimes we become people we never thought we could be, just to survive. Is that what happened to you? In a way, I became smaller, quieter. I traded connection for safety because connection meant the possibility of loss, and I couldn't bear to lose anyone else. Mark turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw a mirror of her own long journey through darkness. How do you find your way back? He asked. I don't know. I thought I'd found peace here, but she gestured around the cabin, suddenly seeing it through his eyes. Maybe I just found a very comfortable prison. When I knocked on your door, I was running from the life I'd built. The kind of work I do, it's not something you can just walk away from. But these past few days with you, it's the first time since I lost my family that I've remembered who I used to be. What kind of work, Mark? Really? The question hung between them like a challenge. Mark stared into the fire for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I help people solve problems. Serious problems. The kind that can't be handled through normal channels. He met her eyes. I'm not a good man, Elise. I've done things, made choices that would horrify you if you knew. Try me. My business partners, they're not the kind of people who accept resignation letters. When you're in my world, you're in it for life. The only way out is... He stopped, shaking his head. I shouldn't have involved you in this. I should have kept walking that night, found somewhere else to wait out the storm. But you didn't. No. I saw your light in the window, and I needed to believe that places like this still existed, that people like you still existed. Elise studied his face, seeing the fear there, but also something else, hope, fragile and desperate, like a candle flame in a hurricane. The man who's been staying in my cabin for 3 days, who made me breakfast and taught me chess and listened to me read my terrible writing. That's who you are, Mark. Not the work you do, not the choices you made when you were drowning in grief. This person, right here, right now. You don't understand. The life I'm involved in it follows you. I can't just pretend it doesn't exist. Then don't pretend. Face it. Choose differently. It's not that simple. His phone rang again, the sound cutting through their conversation like a blade. This time, Mark stared at it without moving, letting it ring until it stopped. Then it started again immediately. Answer it, Elise said. Whatever this is, ignoring it won't make it go away. Mark picked up the phone with obvious reluctance. Castellano. Even sitting beside him, Elise could hear the angry voice on the other end, rapid-fire words in what sounded like Italian mixed with English. Mark's responses were terse, controlled, but she could see his jaw tightening with each exchange. I told you, I need more time, he said finally. The situation is delicate, more shouting from the other end. No, absolutely not. We handle this my way or not at all. Mark's voice carried an authority she hadn't heard before, a quiet command that brooked no argument. You have 48 hours to consider my proposal. After that, I'm out. He ended the call and immediately turned off the phone, his hands steady now, his expression resolved. What just happened? Elise asked. I bought us some time. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that hadn't been there before: determination. There's something else you need to know about me, about my real name. But first, I need you to understand that everything I've told you about losing my family, about who I am, underneath all the complications, that's all true. Okay. My name isn't Mark Stevens. It's Marco Castellano. He watched her face carefully as he spoke. And the family business I'm trying to walk away from, it's not exactly legal. The admission settled between them like stones dropping into still water. Elise felt the weight of it, the danger it represented, but also the trust it implied. He was telling her the truth, finally, completely, even though it might cost him everything. What kind of illegal? She asked, though part of her already knew. The kind that makes the evening news when it goes wrong. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Elise stared at Marco, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had made her breakfast with the implications of what he'd just revealed. The evening news. Crime families. The kind of illegal that destroyed lives. "I need some air," she said, standing abruptly and moving toward the kitchen window. Outside, the world remained pristine and white, untouched by the darkness that had just entered her sanctuary. "Elise, give me a minute, please." She gripped the edge of the sink, her mind racing. Everything made sense now. The expensive clothes, the Rolex, the way he moved with quiet authority, the phone calls he couldn't ignore. Marco Castellano wasn't just running from a difficult job, he was running from organized crime, and she had stitched up his wounds and let him into her bed. No, not her bed, but into her heart, which somehow felt more dangerous. "I should have told you from the beginning," Marco said from behind her, "but I was afraid." "Afraid of what? That I'd turn you away?" She turned to face him, and was surprised to find anger rather than fear rising in her chest. "Or afraid that I'd call the police?" "Both. Neither." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd come to find endearing, but now seemed calculated. "I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now." "How am I looking at you?" "Like I'm a stranger. Like the past 3 days meant nothing. Didn't they? How much of this has been real, Marco? The man who taught me chess, who shared stories about his wife and daughter, was any of that true? All of it." His voice was fierce, desperate. "Every word about Maria and Sofia, every moment we've shared, that's who I really am. The business, the name everyone knows, that's what I became after I lost them." Elise wanted to believe him. The alternative, that she'd been played by a professional criminal, was too humiliating to consider. But doubt had crept in like cold air through a crack in the foundation. "What kind of business?" she asked. "Exactly." Marco was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "My family, my father, built an organization that handles problems other people can't solve. Disputes between businesses, protection for people who need it, arbitration when legal channels won't work." "You're talking about the Mafia." "I'm talking about a business that operates outside conventional structures, because conventional structures don't work for everyone." That's a very sanitized way of describing organized crime. Crime is what people call it when they don't understand the complexities involved. Marco's tone grew sharper, and for the first time, Elise caught a glimpse of the man who commanded enough respect to make people afraid. "We provide services." "Stop." Elise held up her hand. "Just stop. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is some kind of alternative business model. I've read the newspapers. I know what crime families do." Marco's carefully controlled facade cracked, and she saw something raw and vulnerable underneath. "You're right," he said quietly. "You want the truth? My father built an empire on fear and violence. When he died, I inherited it. I told myself I could change it, make it more legitimate, more humane. But you can't clean blood with more blood. So you decided to run away." "I decided to try to get out before I became someone my daughter would be ashamed of." The mention of Sofia hit Elise like a physical blow. She could see the pain in his eyes when he spoke about his child, the genuine grief that couldn't be faked. But she could also see the weight of choices that had led him to her door. "The meeting in Aspen," she said. "That wasn't a business consultation, was it?" "No, it was supposed to be a negotiation, a way to transfer my responsibilities to someone else without starting a war." Marco sat heavily on the couch, suddenly looking every one of his 50-odd years. "But my partners, my family, they don't see retirement as an option. What do they see it as? Betrayal." The word fell between them like a stone into deep water. Elise felt the implications ripple outward, touching every corner of her carefully ordered world. "So when you crashed your car and ended up here, it wasn't an accident?" Marco met her eyes, and she saw the truth there, stark and frightening. Someone tried to kill me on that mountain road. I managed to get control of the car, but not before it went over the embankment. And you came to my door bleeding. I came to your door dying. Not just from the wound from everything I'd become. And you saved me, not just my life, but he gestured helplessly. You reminded me who I used to be. Elise walked to the window, again, staring out at the snow that had seemed so peaceful just hours ago. Now it felt like a trap, cutting them off from the outside world, from help, from escape. Are they still looking for you? Yes. Will they find you? Eventually. Here. Marco's silence was answer enough. You brought them to my door, she said, the realization hitting her like cold water. By staying here, by making those phone calls, you've put me in danger. I'll leave, tonight, if I have to. I'll draw them away from here. In a blizzard, with a hole in your side. You'll die out there. Better me than you. Elise closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Everything rational told her to let him go, to save herself, to return to the safe isolation she'd cultivated for 10 years. But when she opened her eyes and looked at Marco, really looked at him, she saw not a criminal, but a broken man trying to find his way back to something resembling honor. There's something I need to show you, she said suddenly, moving to the bookshelf beside the fireplace. From behind a row of David's woodworking magazines, she pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was David's service revolver, a .38. Special he'd kept from his brief stint in the Army Reserves. Marco's eyebrows rose. You know how to use that? David taught me. Said a woman living alone should know how to protect herself. She checked the cylinder still loaded after all these years. I haven't fired it since he died, but I remember the basics. Elise, what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe I'm tired of being safe. Maybe I'm tired of letting fear make all my decisions. She met his eyes across the small space that had somehow become the center of her universe. I'm saying that if you're planning to make a stand, you don't have to make it alone. You don't understand what you're offering. These people, they don't negotiate. They don't show mercy. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them. Marco stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with competing impulses, the desire to protect her, warring with the need to accept her help. Why? He asked finally. Why would you risk everything for someone you've known for 3 days? Elise considered the question, surprised by how easily the answer came. Because 3 days ago, I was dying too, just more slowly, more quietly. And you, the man who taught me chess and made me remember what it felt like to laugh, you're worth fighting for. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling around the cabin. But inside, in the warm glow of the fireplace, 2 people who had given up on hope began to plan for a battle that would determine whether they had a future together or any future at all. The decision, once made, transformed the cabin from sanctuary to fortress. Marco moved with a purposefulness that reminded Elise he hadn't survived in his world through luck alone. Within an hour, he had assessed every entry point, every line of sight, every tactical advantage the remote location offered. The good news is the single access road, he said, sketching a rough map on the back of an envelope. They can't surround us without coming cross-country through deep snow. The bad news is that same road is our only way out. Elise watched him work, noting how his entire demeanor had shifted. The gentle man who had taught her chess was still there, but now she could see the steel underneath the quality that had made him a leader in a world where weakness meant death. How many will they send? She asked. Depends on who made the call. If it's my cousin Tony, probably just 2 or 3 men. He still thinks this is about bringing me home. Marco's expression darkened. If it's Salvatore Benedetti. Who's Salvatore Benedetti? Someone who's been waiting 20 years for an excuse to eliminate the Castellano family permanently. Marco set down his pen and looked at her directly. There's something else you need to know. The meeting in Aspen, it wasn't just about me stepping down. There's been a war brewing between families for months. Territory disputes, old grudges. I was trying to broker peace, but someone leaked the location. You think this Benedetti was behind the attempt on your life? I know he was. And now that I've gone missing, Marco ran his hands through his hair. By now, he'll have convinced the other families that I'm either dead or planning something against them. Either way, he'll use it as justification to move against my people. The weight of it settled over Elise like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about Marco's personal decision to leave his criminal life behind. His disappearance had set larger forces in motion, forces that would destroy innocent people regardless of what happened in her mountain cabin. "You have to go back," she said quietly. "Don't you? If you don't, people will die. People will die anyway. The question is whether I die with them or—" He stopped, looking at her with something like wonder. "You understand, don't you? You see why I can't just run. You're not the type of man who abandons his responsibilities, even when he wants to. Even when staying means I'll probably never see you again." The words hung between them, carrying the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they'd discovered too late. Elise felt her heart breaking for possibilities that would never be explored, for the life they might have built together if circumstances had been different. "There might be another way," she said slowly, an idea forming. "What do you mean?" "You said Benedetti is using your disappearance to justify moving against your family. What if you weren't missing? What if you showed up, very publicly, very much alive?" Marco was already shaking his head. That's exactly what he wants. One clear shot, not one shot. A meeting, a negotiation. Elise pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys. "You're a mediator, right? You solve problems. So solve this one." "Elise, you don't understand. I understand that you're thinking like someone who's been running and hiding, but you're not hiding anymore. You're planning." She turned the laptop screen toward him, showing a news article about a conference center in Denver. "What if you called a meeting? All the families, neutral ground, media present. Make it impossible for anyone to start shooting without destroying themselves in the process." Marco stared at the screen, and she could see him working through the logistics, the possibilities, the risks. "It could work," he said slowly, "but it would have to be soon. Before Benedetti makes his move, and I'd need leverage, something to bring everyone to the table." "What kind of leverage?" "Information. Proof of what he's been planning, evidence that would destroy him if it became public." Marco's eyes lit up with the first hope she'd seen since his phone calls began. "There's a place, a safe house, where we keep certain records. If I could get there—" "Where?" 2 hours from here. "But Elise, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm volunteering." "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than staying here and waiting for them to come, because they will come, Marco. You said so yourself." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried terrible risks. "If we did this," he said finally, "if we went to get those files once we do, there's no going back. You'd be involved in this world, whether you want to be or not." "I'm already involved. The moment I opened my door to you, I chose a side. You chose to help someone who was hurt. That's different from choosing to fight a war." Elise thought about that, about the woman she'd been when Marco knocked on her door 3 days ago. That woman would have been terrified by this conversation, would have begged him to leave, would have chosen safety over everything else. "Maybe," she said, "but I think I've been fighting a war for 10 years, a war against life, against hope, against the possibility that I could be happy again, and I'm tired of losing." Marco reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, surprisingly gentle for hands that she now knew had done terrible things. "If we do this, if we walk out that door together, I can't guarantee we'll both walk back. Can you guarantee we'll survive if we stay?" "No." "Then let's go down fighting. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Marco explained the route to the safe house, the security measures they'd face, the people they might encounter. He taught her basic hand signals, showed her how to move quietly, how to watch for threats. It was a crash course in survival that felt surreal against the backdrop of her cozy cabin. "There's one more thing," Marco said as they prepared to leave. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small silver medallion on a thin chain. "This was my father's. Street. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers." The medal was worn smooth from decades of handling, engraved with a prayer in Italian. Marco held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the familiar words. "He gave it to me when I was 21, told me it would keep me safe as long as I remembered who I was underneath everything else." Marco's voice was soft, reverent. "I want you to have it." "Marco, I can't, please." He reached around her neck, fastening the chain with careful fingers. "For luck, and so you'll remember that whatever happens tonight, you helped me find my way back to the man my father raised." The medal settled against her chest, warm from his touch. It felt like a promise, a benediction, a prayer for safe passage through whatever darkness lay ahead. They checked their weapons one final time. David's revolver for Elise, a pistol Marco had retrieved from his luggage for himself. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was arming herself with her dead husband's gun to protect the man who had taught her to live again. "Are you ready?" Marco asked, his hand on the door handle. Elise looked around the cabin one more time at the chess set, still arranged on the table, at the fireplace where they'd shared so many conversations, at the laptop where her unfinished novel waited for an ending she now might never write. "Yes," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Let's go save your family." And with that, they stepped out into the night, leaving behind the safety of her mountain sanctuary for a world where love and violence walked hand in hand, where the price of redemption was paid in blood and courage, and where two broken people would discover whether their newfound hope was strong enough to survive the darkness that awaited them. The snow crunched under their feet as they made their way to Marco's hidden vehicle, and Elise realized that for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't running away from her life, she was running toward it. The safe house sat in darkness at the end of a winding gravel road, a modest ranch home that looked like 1,000 others scattered across Colorado's suburbs. Only the sophisticated security system and reinforced windows hinted at its true purpose. Marco had been silent during the 2-hour drive, his attention split between the road and the rearview mirror, watching for signs they'd been followed. "It looks empty," Elise whispered as they sat in the car, studying the building. "It's supposed to, but that doesn't mean it is." Marco checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. "We go in fast, get what we need and get out. 15 minutes, maximum." The security system disarmed with a soft beep as Marco entered a code. Inside, the house felt sterile, unlived in, more like an office than a home. Marco led her down a hallway lined with innocuous family photographs that she realized were probably covers for surveillance equipment. In the back bedroom, he moved aside a heavy dresser to reveal a wall safe. His fingers worked the combination with practiced ease, and the door swung open to reveal stacks of documents, computer drives, and what looked like surveillance photographs. "Insurance policies," Marco explained, pulling out a thick folder. "Records of every dirty deal, every illegal transaction, every piece of evidence that could destroy half the criminal organizations on the East Coast." Elise watched him work, noting how his movements had become more economical, more focused. This was Marco Castellano, in his element, dangerous, competent, absolutely in control. "Found it," he said, holding up a manila envelope. "Financial records showing Benedetti's been skimming from the other families for years, plus photos of him meeting with federal agents." He looked up at her, his expression grim. "This is enough to start a war or end one, depending on how it's used." "Then let's end one." Marco was transferring files to a flash drive when the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that made you question whether your eyes were open. In the silence that followed, Elise could hear her heartbeat thundering in her ears and the soft sound of Marco's breathing beside her. "Stay exactly where you are," he whispered, his voice so low she felt it more than heard it. "Don't move, don't speak." Through the walls came the sound of footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the careful precision of people who knew how to be quiet. A floorboard creaked near the front door, a window frame groaned under pressure. Marco's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers squeezing once in reassurance before releasing her. She heard the soft slide of metal as he drew his weapon. "Marco Castellano." The voice came from the living room, loud enough to carry through the house. "We know you're in there. Let's talk." "Benedetti," Marco breathed, so quietly only Elise could hear. "You've caused quite a stir, disappearing like that," the voice continued, moving closer to their location. "People are worried. People are asking questions. That's not good for business." Marco leaned close to Elise's ear. "There's a back window in the bathroom. When I give the signal, you go. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are. This was always how it was going to end." "No." Her whisper was fierce. "We do this together or not at all." Before Marco could argue, the bedroom door exploded inward. The darkness erupted into chaos. Flashlight beams cut through the air like knives, illuminating fragments of the room in stark relief. Marco moved with lethal grace, using the furniture for cover as he returned fire. The sound of gunshots was deafening in the confined space. Elise pressed herself against the wall beside the safe, clutching the envelope of evidence to her chest. In the strobing light of muzzle flashes, she caught glimpses of the battle Marco diving behind the overturned dresser, armed figures advancing through the doorway, the air filling with smoke and the smell of cordite. "Give it up, Marco." Benedetti's voice carried over the gunfire. "You're outnumbered. Send out the woman and we'll make this quick." "Like hell," Marco snarled back, reloading with swift efficiency. But Elise could see what he couldn't, another figure moving along the outside wall, heading for the bathroom window he'd wanted her to use as an escape route. They were being flanked, trapped in a room with no exits. That's when she remembered David's voice from years ago, teaching her to shoot. "In a crisis, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of training." She pulled out David's revolver, surprised by how steady her hands were. The weight of it was familiar, comforting in a way that would have horrified her a week ago. Through the chaos, she could see the figure at the window raising his weapon toward Marco's back. Time slowed. She raised the gun, sighted down the barrel the way David had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the room like thunder. The figure at the window spun and fell. In the sudden silence that followed, she heard Benedetti's voice, closer now. "Interesting. The accountant's widow has teeth. More than you know," Elise said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. And then the real battle began. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Elise could have imagined. Marco moved through the chaos with deadly precision, using every piece of furniture, every shadow, every angle of the room to his advantage. But they were outnumbered 4-1, and ammunition wouldn't last forever. "The basement," Marco called to her during a brief lull in the shooting. "There's a tunnel that leads to the garage next door. What about the evidence?" "You have it. That's what matters." Elise clutched the envelope tighter, understanding now that everything depended on her getting those documents to safety. But as they moved toward the basement door, Benedetti's voice cut through the darkness. "Burn it down," he ordered, "all of it." The smell of gasoline filled the air, followed quickly by the orange glow of flames. Benedetti wasn't just trying to kill them, he was destroying the evidence, the safe house, everything that could connect him to years of criminal activity. "The tunnel's compromised," Marco said, watching smoke seep under the basement door. "They're covering all the exits." They were trapped in a burning house with armed killers, and Elise realized with crystalline clarity that this was how their story would end. 3 days of finding love again, of rediscovering hope, only to die together in flames and gunfire. But then she remembered something David had built, something Marco didn't know about. The root cellar, she said suddenly. David built a storm shelter under the back bedroom. It has an independent entrance through the garden. Marco's eyes widened. Can we get to it? If we move fast. What followed was the longest 60 seconds of Elise's life. They fought their way through smoke and bullets, Marco providing cover while she used the butt of David's gun to smash through the floorboards. David had carefully concealed. Below, a ladder led down into darkness. Go, Marco ordered, but Elise could see blood seeping through his shirt where a bullet had found its mark. Not without you, Elise. Together or not at all. Marco nodded, and they descended into the hidden space David had carved out of the earth years ago. It was small, cramped, designed to protect a family from tornadoes. Now it would either save them or become their tomb. Above them, the house burned. They could hear Benedetti's men moving through the rooms, searching, cursing, eventually retreating as the fire grew too intense. The air in the cellar grew thick with smoke seeping through the floorboards. The exit's on the other side, Elise whispered, crawling through the narrow space toward where David had installed an emergency hatch camouflaged among the garden rocks. They emerged into the cold night air, 50 yards from the burning house, gasping and coughing, covered in soot and blood. In the distance, sirens wailed. Neighbors had called the fire department. We need to get out of here before the authorities arrive, Marco said, leaning heavily against a tree. His injury was worse than he'd let on. You need a hospital. I need to end this. He looked at the envelope in her hands. Did the files survive? Elise checked. The manila folder was singed but intact, the evidence that could destroy Benedetti still readable. What now? She asked. Marco pulled out his phone, dialing a number with shaking fingers. Tony? It's Marco. I'm alive, and I have something you need to see. As he spoke to his cousin, explaining about Benedetti's betrayal, about the evidence they'd recovered. Elise watched the house burn and thought about transformation. A week ago, she'd been a woman hiding from life in a mountain cabin. Tonight, she'd crawled through gunfire to save the man she loved and the family he was trying to protect. It's done, Marco said, ending the call. Tony's calling an emergency meeting. All the families, tomorrow night, public venue, media present. Just like you suggested. Will it work? It has to, because the alternative is war and too many innocent people would die. They made their way to their car, moving slowly because of Marco's injury. As they drove away from the burning safe house, emergency vehicles racing past them in the opposite direction, Elise felt the weight of what they'd accomplished and what still lay ahead. There's something I need to tell you, Marco said as they headed back toward the mountains. After tomorrow night, after this is finished, I can't go back to being Marco Castellano. That man, that life, it has to end. What will you be? I don't know. Maybe just Mark Stevens, the man who learned to play chess in a mountain cabin. He glanced at her, hope and fear warring in his expression. If that man would be welcome there. Elise touched the Street Christopher medal at her throat, feeling its warmth against her skin. He would be, she said quietly. He very much would be. Behind them, the safe house burned to ash, taking with it the last traces of Marco Castellano's criminal empire. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. They were driving toward morning, toward a new beginning built on truth instead of lies, toward a love that had survived fire and bullets and the weight of dark secrets. They were driving toward home. 6 months later, Elise stood at the kitchen window of her mountain cabin, watching Mark tend to the vegetable garden David had started and he had expanded. The morning light caught the silver in his hair more pronounced now, she thought, though whether from age or stress, she couldn't say. His movements were careful still, favoring his left side where Benedetti's bullet had done more damage than he'd initially admitted. The public meeting had worked exactly as she'd predicted. Faced with irrefutable evidence of Benedetti's betrayal and the threat of media exposure, The assembled crime families had made a choice between war and peace. Benedetti had been found 3 days later, floating in the Hudson River, the victim of his own ambitions. Marco Castellano had been officially declared dead in the safe house fire, allowing Mark Stevens to emerge from the ashes with a clean slate and a second chance at life. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," Mark said, coming through the back door with dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction in his voice. David knew what he was doing when he chose this spot. It had taken time for Mark to speak naturally about David, to understand that honoring Elise's past didn't diminish their present. She'd kept David's tools, his photographs, the chess set he'd carved with such care. But she'd also made room for new memories, new traditions, new hope. "Sarah called," Elise said, pouring him coffee in the mug that had become his over the months. "She wants to know if you'll be coming to Emma's graduation party next weekend. Do you want me to come?" It was a question he still asked, even after all this time checking, making sure, never taking her feelings for granted. She loved him for that caution, for the way he treated their relationship like something precious that could break if handled roughly. "I want you to come. Emma wants you to come. Even Sarah wants you to come, though she still thinks there's something suspicious about a businessman who doesn't own a cell phone." Mark laughed, the sound warm and genuine. He'd kept his promise about technology, maintaining only a landline for emergencies and a secure email account for his consulting work, the legitimate kind, helping small businesses resolve disputes through mediation rather than intimidation. The transition hadn't been easy. The first month after the meeting, Mark had suffered nightmares that left him gasping and disoriented, reliving moments from his criminal past. Some nights, Elise would find him sitting on the porch at 3 in the morning, staring out at the snow-covered landscape as if searching for something he'd lost. She learned not to startle him awake, not to ask too many questions about the shadows that still haunted him. Instead, she simply sat beside him, offering her presence as an anchor to the peaceful world they were building together. "I'll go," he said. "Though I still think your family believes I'm running from something. You are running from something, we both are. The difference is we're running toward each other instead of away from everything else." The healing hadn't been linear. There were setbacks, days when Mark retreated into himself, overwhelmed by guilt over the choices he'd made before finding her. Days when Elise wondered if she was strong enough to love someone carrying so much darkness. But they'd learned to navigate those rough patches together, to trust that love could coexist with imperfection. Mark's legitimate consulting business had grown slowly but steadily. Word had spread about the quiet man in the mountains who could resolve conflicts that seemed impossible. He worked mostly with family businesses, helping them navigate disputes without destroying relationships. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. He was using skills learned in the criminal world to help people solve problems through communication rather than violence. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you," Mark said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "Tony called yesterday. He's getting married next month, and he asked if I'd stand up for him." Elise paused in wiping down the counter. Tony was Marco's cousin, the only member of his former family who knew the truth about his survival. Their relationship had evolved carefully over the months, periodic phone calls, always cautious, always respectful of the new life Mark was building. "What did you tell him?" "That I needed to talk to you first. It would mean going back to New York, being around people who knew me as Marco." Mark's expression was troubled. "I want to be there for him, but not if it makes you uncomfortable." "It doesn't make me uncomfortable. But are you ready for it?" Mark considered the question seriously, as he did all matters related to his past. "I think so. I'm not the same man who left that world 6 months ago. Tony sees that. He says the other families respect the choice I made, that walking away took more courage than staying would have. Then we'll go together." "Elise, together," she repeated, firmly. "I'm not going to let you face that alone." Mark set down his coffee and moved to the small jewelry box that sat on the kitchen counter. From it, He withdrew 2 simple gold bands, not expensive, not ostentatious, but perfect in their simplicity. "Which reminds me," he said, getting down on one knee with the kind of old-fashioned formality that made her heart skip. "Elise Morrison, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" It wasn't the first time he'd asked. He'd been proposing in small ways for months, through shared glances, through the way he'd started talking about our future instead of the future, through his insistence on learning to make David's favorite pancake recipe because he wanted to be part of all her traditions. But this was the first time he'd asked with rings, and the first time she was ready to say yes without reservation. "Yes," she said, kneeling to meet him at eye level, "but only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me we'll keep learning new things about each other. Promise me we'll never stop being curious about who we're becoming." Mark slipped the ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him. The gold felt warm, substantial, like a promise made tangible. "I promise," he said, "though I have to warn you, I'm planning to spend the rest of my life discovering new ways to love you." They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony beside the cabin, with Sarah and her family in attendance along with Dr. Richards and Martha from the grocery store. Tom, from the hardware store, gave Elise away, and Mark's cousin Tony served as best man, the only connection to his former life that Mark had maintained. The ceremony was simple, honest, focused on the promises they were making rather than the celebration surrounding them. When they exchanged vows, Elise spoke about second chances and the courage to trust again. Mark talked about finding home in a person rather than a place, about learning that love could be stronger than fear. "When I knocked on your door that night," Mark said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "I was dying, not just from the wound, but from the weight of choices that had crushed the man I used to be. You saved my life, but more than that, you reminded me who I could still become." Elise's vows were equally heartfelt. "For 10 years I thought grief was something to overcome, that healing meant forgetting. You taught me that the heart can hold both sorrow and joy, that honoring the past and embracing the future aren't mutually exclusive. You didn't ask me to stop loving David, you helped me understand that love multiplies rather than divides." As autumn approached, Elise finished her novel. The story of Claire, the widow by the sea, had found its ending at last, not in solitude, but in the discovery that healing and loving weren't mutually exclusive. Her publisher was interested, though Elise found she cared less about commercial success than about having told a true story about the resilience of the human heart. The completion of the book felt symbolic proof that her creative life had been reborn along with her emotional one. Writing had become a source of joy again, rather than a refuge from pain. She wrote in the mornings now, while Mark worked in the garden, both of them productive and peaceful in their parallel solitudes. "I'm thinking of writing a cookbook next," Mark said one evening as they prepared dinner together. "All the recipes Maria taught me, plus some new ones we've discovered together. That's a beautiful idea, a way to honor her memory while celebrating what we've built. I thought I could dedicate it to both the women who taught me that cooking is an act of love, Maria, who showed me how to nourish a family, and you, who showed me how to feed a soul." Now, as she sat at her desk in the loft, working on a new book, this one about a crime boss who discovered redemption in an unlikely place, she could hear Mark downstairs preparing lunch, humming an old song his wife Maria had loved. He'd been afraid, at first, that keeping Maria's memory would hurt Elise. Instead, she'd encouraged him to share those stories, understanding that love wasn't diminished by being divided. The new novel was flowing more easily than anything she'd written before. The story of redemption felt personal now, informed by watching Mark transform from Marco Castellano into the man he was always meant to be. She wrote about the complexity of change, about how people could carry darkness and light simultaneously, about the way love could serve as both mirror and lamp, showing us who we are and illuminating who we might become. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Mark answered it, and she heard him speaking in the careful, professional tone he used for his mediation clients. "Stevens Consulting," he said. "How can I help you find a solution?" She listened to the big rhythm of his voice, noting how different it sounded from those first desperate phone calls 6 months ago. There was confidence now, purpose, the satisfaction of a man who'd found meaningful work that aligned with his values. "That was interesting," Mark said when he came upstairs 20 minutes later. "A family vineyard in California. 3 generations trying to decide whether to sell to a corporate buyer or keep the business in the family. They want me to fly out next week to mediate. Will you take it? Only if you come with me. I thought we could make it a small vacation visit, Napa, stay at that bed and breakfast you mentioned." It was like him to think of her, to consider her needs and desires in every decision. The criminal who had once made unilateral choices affecting hundreds of lives now consulted his wife about weekend plans. "I'd love that," she said, saving her work and closing the laptop, "though I have to admit I'm curious to see you in action." Professional mediator Mark Stevens, solving problems through negotiation instead of intimidation. "It's not as different as you might think. The same skills that kept me alive in my old world, reading people, understanding what they really want, finding solutions that let everyone save face. They just serve a different purpose now." They spent the evening on the porch, wrapped in blankets and watching the first snow of winter begin to fall. It was a scene that had become routine over the months, this quiet sharing of the day's events, this peaceful transition from productivity to rest. "Do you ever miss it?" Elise asked, the question that had been forming for weeks finally finding voice. The power, the respect, the certainty of that world? Mark was quiet for a long time, considering. "I miss the simplicity sometimes. In that world, problems had clear solutions, usually involving money or force. This world is more complicated. People are messier, harder to predict." But he squeezed her, and, in that world, I was always waiting for someone to challenge me, to try to take what I'd built. Here, I'm building something that can't be taken away. What's that? A life worth living, a love worth protecting, a future I actually want to see. As they sat in the comfortable silence that had become their trademark, Elise reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman who measured her days in coffee cups and crossword puzzles, hiding from life in the name of honoring death. Mark had been a criminal running from his own shadow, carrying guilt and violence like stones in his pockets. Now they were husband and wife, partners in the truest sense, having learned that redemption wasn't something you achieved, but something you practiced daily. They'd discovered that love after loss looked different from young love, more grateful, more intentional, more aware of its own fragility, and therefore more precious. "I have something for you," Mark said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package. "I was going to wait for Christmas, but inside was a pendant, a small silver mountain peak with tiny diamonds arranged like stars above it. It was beautiful, but it was the inscription on the back that made her breath catch. 'Where I found my way home. Mark, I know you still wear the Street, the Christopher medal, and I love that you do, but I wanted you to have something that was just ours, something that marked the beginning of our story instead of the middle.' She fastened the necklace, feeling its weight settle beside the medal that had seen her through their most dangerous night. 2 pieces of jewelry, representing 2 kinds of love, the protective blessing of a man's faith in her courage, and the celebrating recognition of what they'd built together. Outside their window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white. But this time, Elise felt no need to brace herself against the silence. She had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness, between safety and healing, between existing and truly living. And she had learned that sometimes the worst storms bring the most precious gifts. If you're brave enough to open the door when love comes knocking, bleeding and desperate, in the middle of a blizzard that changes everything, The mountain would be quiet for months now, wrapped in winter's embrace. But inside the cabin, two hearts beat in rhythm, writing the beginning of a story that would last the rest of their lives. A story about second chances, about the courage to trust again, about the discovery that love could indeed be stronger than fear.